Get out of that seat now. You're making the other passengers uncomfortable. The words cracked through the quiet hum of Atlantic Airlines Flight 472, sharp as breaking glass, echoing against the polished surfaces of the first-class cabin where the morning light slanted through half-drawn shades. Susan Bell, the lead flight attendant, her hair pulled tight, uniform impeccable, voice clipped with practiced authority, stood rigid in the aisle, pointing straight at Angela Harris, a poised black woman in her early 40s sitting alone in seat 1A. Angela did not move, her spine perfectly straight, hands resting on a leather journal in her lap, her tailored charcoal gray suit immaculate, pearl earrings catching the soft light from the cabin's overhead lamps. Her expression betrayed nothing, not anger, not fear, not confusion, just stillness, a quietness that radiated far louder than words. Around her, the passengers shifted uncomfortably in their wide leather seats, some averting their gaze, others watching with furtive curiosity, as if debating internally whether they ought to say something or remain politely silent. Angela had boarded early, her ticket checked, her bag stowed neatly beneath her seat. Her husband, Robert Harris, CEO of Orion Technologies, had booked the flight personally, a first-class ticket, flagged as VIP, no mistakes, no ambiguities. But in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. Susan's gaze didn't waver, her words hanging heavy, carried on the cool, conditioned air. "This is first class, ma'am. You must be in the wrong seat." Angela raised her gaze slowly, her voice even and soft but resolute. "I have a valid first-class ticket for seat 1A. She reached calmly into the inside pocket of her blazer and produced the boarding pass, holding it steady in her hand as an offering of proof she should not have needed to make. The paper trembled only slightly between her fingers, not from fear, but from the tension wound so tightly inside her chest. Susan didn't lean in to examine the ticket. She didn't scan it, didn't even seem to acknowledge it existed. Instead, she crossed her arms, a smile curving at the edges of her mouth, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and she said with a voice lined in condescension, "Sweetheart, maybe you're confused. Let me help you back to your proper seat. Policy requires us to reseat passengers who might cause concern for others." Angela inhaled, a deep, deliberate breath, feeling the prickle of humiliation not just beneath her skin, but seeping into the fabric of the morning itself, staining what should have been an ordinary journey. She could sense the eyes on her, the sidelong glances, the hushed calculations unfolding in the minds of those around her, wondering perhaps why this particular woman sat where she did, whether she belonged there at all. She didn't flinch. "I'm not confused," she said softly, lifting her chin slightly, voice steady but unmistakably firm. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Her words, though measured, carried the weight of years of being asked quietly or bluntly to explain her presence, to justify her place in rooms where her competence and grace ought to have sufficed. Susan leaned down now, lowering her voice to a hush intended to sound kind but dripping with dismissal. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause a scene. Please, just move quietly to the back. Let's not make this difficult." Angela did not speak immediately. She set the boarding pass gently on the armrest, folding her hands neatly again, letting the silence expand between them, a silence that felt almost sacred in its restraint. "Do what you must," she said at last, her tone like the still surface of deep water, calm but impenetrable. The passengers around them shifted again. The man in 1B cleared his throat but said nothing. Across the aisle, Maria Rodriguez, a middle-aged Latina woman in 2C, leaned forward as if she might speak but hesitated. Edward Clark, an older white gentleman in seat 1D, watched closely, his expression unreadable. Susan straightened her posture and gave a sharp nod. "Captain Evans will be informed," she announced, loud enough now for half the cabin to hear. "We will reseat this passenger for the comfort of others." Angela felt her breath lodge somewhere deep in her chest, a familiar tightening that did not make her smaller, but steadier. She glanced briefly toward the front of the aircraft, where the door remained open and sunlight streamed faintly from the gate beyond. Somewhere out there she knew Robert was arriving soon, and with that thought she anchored herself further into stillness, into composure, into grace. She said nothing more, but in her silence she spoke volumes. Angela Harris had always known how to carry herself, not with ostentation, but with quiet confidence, honed through years of navigating spaces where she was often the only one who looked like her, dressed like her, spoke like her. As a respected educator and vice principal at a public high school in Atlanta, she understood dignity was not something you were simply given, it was something you carried, even when others sought to strip it away. Her poise, polished and deliberate, was armor built over decades, reinforced by experience and expectation. This morning's flight to New York was meant to be a brief reprieve, a purposeful journey but not a burdensome one. She was traveling to keynote a youth leadership conference, invited for her work mentoring students from underrepresented communities, her voice celebrated in classrooms and auditoriums alike. Robert, meticulous as ever, had ensured that she would travel in comfort, booking her first-class seat well in advance, noting her dietary preferences, arranging every detail with care and thoughtfulness. He had left a small handwritten note on her breakfast tray before departing early for meetings. "Travel safe, my love. Dignity is your constant companion. Always." Yet here, in seat 1A, that dignity was being tested once again, not by loud insult but by something quieter, more corrosive: assumption. This was not her first encounter with such assumption. She remembered the hotel lobby in Chicago 2 years ago when a concierge, seeing her check in alone, assumed she must be part of the housekeeping staff and handed her towels rather than her room key. She remembered the conference in Miami where a fellow speaker asked her whose assistant she was, despite her name printed boldly on the agenda beside the keynote slot. These were moments that never screamed but always cut, moments that taught her early how perception could bend reality and turn respect into something conditional. But on airplanes there had always been a particular sting. 30,000 feet in the air, hierarchy felt more rigid. The divide between first class and the rest, not just in seats or amenities, but in expectation. A hidden ledger in which passengers were silently assessed. Was this person meant to be here? Angela had felt it before, in fleeting glances, in hesitations from flight attendants, but never quite so blatant as today. This was supposed to be a peaceful morning, a chance to reflect quietly as the plane carried her northward, a morning with a window view and warm coffee served without question or suspicion. Instead, she sat now suspended not between Atlanta and New York, but between two familiar worlds. The world where her credentials, her achievements, her manners spoke for themselves, and the world where none of that seemed to matter the moment her face was seen before her boarding pass. Her silence now was not acquiescence, it was preparation. She knew Robert was nearby, that he would be at the airport soon, and she took comfort in that knowledge. Not because she needed rescue, but because they understood each other's battles without needing to say a word. His presence was her mirror, deliberate, composed, and unwilling to let prejudice pass unnoticed. This moment on Flight 4002 was not isolated, she knew. It was another bead threaded onto a long chain of similar incidents that stretched behind her. A chain that Robert knew well, that their children were already learning to recognize. And so she sat still, hands folded on her lap, back straight as always, with the calm strength of someone who had weathered these storms before and would weather this one too, quietly determined that this would not pass without being remembered. Mark Evans, the first officer, emerged from the cockpit with an air of detached authority, clipboard in hand, face carefully neutral but distant, as if preferring to resolve the matter swiftly so the flight could proceed without delay. He did not address Angela directly at first. Instead, he turned to Susan Bell, who spoke quickly, her voice lowered but not low enough for Angela to miss. Disruptive passenger in 1A refusing to comply. We're moving her back for passenger comfort. Mark gave a perfunctory nod and stepped forward, addressing Angela with a practiced smile that felt hollow in its efficiency. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move to another seat," he said evenly, his gaze flickering briefly toward the boarding pass still resting on her armrest, but never settling there, never acknowledging the proof of her right to be exactly where she was seated. Angela did not rise. She met his gaze without wavering, her voice as level as before. "This is my assigned seat. I have done nothing disruptive." Mark's smile did not falter, but the sharpness behind his eyes hardened slightly. "We need to avoid delays, ma'am. Please cooperate." That word, cooperate, hung in the air like a gavel striking down judgment before trial. Around her no one spoke. The silence from the other passengers was dense, oppressive, full of unseen calculations. How much should they care? Would they risk speaking up? Did this woman really belong here? Angela felt the burn of that silence more than she felt the eyes. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself, feeling the familiar ache of being alone in a crowd that chose to look away. With a grace that belied the humiliation pulsing beneath her skin, she gathered her leather handbag and her journal, rising carefully from the plush seat. She did not allow herself to glance at Susan Bell, whose posture now suggested she had won something she was too blind to understand. Her steps down the aisle were measured, composed, but inside her chest a storm raged, a storm she would not let show. Mark gestured toward row 28, just in front of the galley door. A seat wedged next to the lavatory, cramped and exposed. It was a space typically reserved for standby passengers or last-minute bookings, far from the quiet privacy of first class, far from the respect that her presence and ticket demanded. Angela sat without a word, setting her bag neatly under the seat in front of her, folding her hands again in her lap, back straight as ever. The low hum of cabin chatter resumed, filling the void left by her forced departure from 1A, but it did not touch her. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered behind raised hands. Further forward, a man peered back briefly, curiosity in his gaze, but no empathy. Near the front, Maria Rodriguez sat rigid in 2C, arms folded tightly, disbelief plain on her face. She had watched every moment, seen the calm with which Angela had presented her boarding pass, heard the polite clarity in her voice. And yet she too had remained silent. Her guilt felt like a weight pressing against her chest. Edward Clark in 1B, who had witnessed it all from mere inches away, stared down at his folded newspaper, shame creeping across his expression, regret forming too late to have mattered. Angela sat still amid the quiet murmurs, feeling not small but isolated, aware of the bruising silence around her. She did not bow her head, did not slump in her seat, but she carried the heaviness of the moment like a stone in her chest, each breath deliberate, each movement restrained. In that corner of the plane, far from the polished wood and sparkling glasses of first class, she became invisible to the crew moving past her. Yet, she knew, deeply, that invisibility was only temporary. Somewhere out there, Robert Harris was on his way. Somewhere out there, the quiet dignity she had held so tightly would soon be met with the presence of a man who understood exactly what was unfolding. And until then, she would remain anchored, upright and silent, unwilling to be diminished even in this small, cruel exile. At the gate, Nina Thompson stood motionless for a moment, tablet still in hand, eyes fixed on the open cabin door where Angela Harris had just disappeared from view. She was young, early in her career, but already familiar with the quiet patterns of injustice that sometimes played out beneath the polished veneer of her workplace. She had checked Angela's boarding pass herself not 30 minutes ago, scanning it carefully at the gate, seeing the clear designation, First Class 1A VIP flagged. An assignment she knew had come with special clearance from the airline's executive services desk. There had been no mistake, no confusion, no ambiguity. And yet, now Susan Bell's voice crackled faintly over her radio, clinical and dismissive. Passenger Harris reseated. Disruption averted, cabin ready for final checks. The language was so polished, so routine, that it almost masked the truth. But Nina felt it, that familiar unease in her gut, the same cold pull she had felt too many times before when policy became a mask for prejudice. She tapped back through Angela's profile on her tablet, double-checking everything once more. Name, seat assignment, VIP clearance, special meal request. All correct. Her heart beat faster, not in panic but in resolve. Without hesitation, Nina reached into her blazer and pulled out her phone. The number she dialed was one she had saved months earlier but had never expected to use. Robert Harris's direct line, marked in her contacts as Orion VIP Contact. His company was one of Atlantic Airlines' largest clients, and his reputation for fairness and precision preceded him. The line connected after just one ring. Robert's voice was calm, deep, deliberate, exactly as she had imagined it would sound, but now edged with a quiet steel. "This is Robert Harris," he said simply. "Mr. Harris," Nina began, her voice low but steady. "This is Nina Thompson at Gate 23, Atlantic Airlines. I thought you should know your wife has just been reseated from 1A to the rear cabin. Susan Bell claimed disruption, but I personally checked Mrs. Harris's boarding pass myself. First class, fully valid, VIP clearance in place. There was no disruption, sir. No cause, no reason." There was a pause, but not a long one. Nina could almost hear Robert's mind working on the other end of the line, the gears turning with measured control, no panic, no wasted energy. When he spoke again, his words were calm but weighted. "Thank you for calling me, Nina. You did the right thing. I'm 5 minutes away. Please keep the door open." His tone didn't rise. He didn't ask for more details. He didn't need to. Nina exhaled quietly and ended the call. She stood for a moment longer, heart still racing, not with fear but with certainty that she had made the only decision her conscience would allow. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and stepped closer to the jet bridge door, watching the passengers inside through the glass. Watching Angela Harris sitting there in 28D, still as stone, graceful even in exile. In that moment, Nina understood something deeper. Some moments required courage, not in grand gestures, but in quiet truth-telling, the kind that simply refused to look away. She straightened her blazer, tapped her radio twice to signal readiness, and waited, not for permission, but for Robert Harris himself, who would arrive soon with the quiet power of presence. The soft chime of the jet bridge door disengaging was almost imperceptible, but its effect rippled quietly through the cabin. Heads lifted. A few passengers shifted in their seats, sensing a shift in the air, though no announcement had been made. Then he stepped inside. Robert Harris. Tall, composed, the crisp lines of his charcoal suit sharp against the muted beige of the cabin walls, a small ID badge clipped neatly to his lapel, bearing not just his name, but his company's insignia. He did not rush, did not storm down the aisle, did not carry the bluster some might have expected from a powerful man summoned to right a wrong. Instead, he moved deliberately, each step measured, his gaze sweeping calmly across the rows, pausing only briefly when he saw Angela seated quietly in 28D, her posture unchanged, her face turned slightly toward the window but her expression serene, unbroken, resolute. Susan Bell caught sight of him almost too late, her practiced smile faltering, replaced quickly by a mask of polite professionalism. She stepped forward, smoothing her apron, but before she could speak, Robert raised a hand, palm open, quiet but absolute. "Captain Reynolds," he said evenly, turning instead toward the cockpit, where the captain had just stepped into view, summoned perhaps by the subtle tension now gathering at the front of the plane. Captain Reynolds was a man in his early 50s, his silver hair and measured gaze suggesting decades of experience managing crisis and calm alike. Yet even he seemed to hesitate as Robert Harris addressed him directly, his voice low but carrying the weight of undeniable authority. "I am Robert Harris," he began without preamble. "My wife, Angela Harris, was removed from her confirmed pre-cleared first-class seat this morning. I'm here for an explanation before this aircraft departs." The words were not a demand, they were a statement of fact, offered as calmly as if discussing a schedule, but beneath the tone was something far more resolute, a stillness that filled the cabin with a sudden, electric gravity. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Harris, I was informed there was a disruptive passenger in 1A that a reseating was required for cabin comfort." Robert's gaze did not waver, his tone unchanged. "There was no disruption," he said plainly. "Only judgment?" Then he allowed a beat of silence to fall, a silence so taut it seemed to press against every surface of the cabin. "I've reviewed the manifest, Captain," Robert continued. "My wife's name is on it, first class, seat 1A marked with VIP clearance. I've also confirmed with my staff that no policy justifies what occurred today." His eyes moved deliberately to Susan Bell, who now stood rigidly at attention, her smile gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You see," Robert said softly, "the question is not whether a mistake was made. The question is why it was made, and why no one here thought to correct it before I arrived." At that moment the cabin felt suspended, as if even the engines outside held their breath. Susan opened her mouth as if to speak but closed it again, her words caught somewhere between apology and excuse. Robert did not press further. Not yet. He simply let the silence speak first, turning his gaze once more to Captain Reynolds. "Shall we proceed, Captain?" he asked. "Or would you prefer to discuss what fairness looks like before we leave this gate?" And in that stillness, with nothing raised but his presence, Robert Harris made it clear that this was no longer just about a seat. It was about the standards under which this aircraft, this crew, and this airline would operate from this moment forward. For a long, quiet moment after Robert Harris's words settled over the cabin, no one moved. The atmosphere had thickened, every passenger attuned not to the typical bustle before takeoff, but to the stillness Robert commanded simply by being present. Susan Bell's hands fluttered briefly at her apron, her gaze darting toward the cockpit as if seeking rescue, but no help came. Captain Reynolds remained standing near the flight deck, his expression measured, cautious, and heavy with realization. Then, softly but clearly, a voice broke the silence. Not Robert's, not Angela's, but from seat 2C. "I saw everything," Maria Rodriguez said, her tone steady but edged with the clarity of conscience that would no longer sit silent. The middle-aged Latino woman rose halfway from her seat, her scarf slipping from one shoulder as she looked directly at Captain Reynolds. This woman, Mrs. Harris, showed her ticket. She was polite, she was dignified, there was no disruption, none. Her voice did not rise, but its certainty made it ring louder than any argument. "She didn't cause this moment, your crew did." A ripple moved through the cabin. Not applause, not outrage, but a murmur of shifting awareness, the collective sound of passengers re-evaluating what they had just witnessed, what they had allowed to unfold in their silence. From seat 1B, Edward Clark, the silver-haired gentleman who had watched Angela all along with an uneasy gaze, slowly folded his newspaper and set it aside. He stood as well, resting one hand lightly on the seat back in front of him for balance, and then spoke. His words carrying the weight of a lifetime lived, watching too many moments like this one. "I'll admit something," he began quietly, his voice cracking, slightly at first, but strengthening with every syllable. "When I saw her sitting in 1A, I wondered for a moment if she was in the wrong seat. I didn't say it out loud, but I thought it, and that was enough. I was wrong. I let my own assumptions speak before I opened my mouth." Then he turned to Robert and nodded slowly, his face etched with something between apology and respect. "You're right, Mr. Harris. This isn't just a mistake. It's a judgment. And we all sat here and let it happen." Other passengers began to shift in their seats too, some offering nods, some murmuring words of agreement, some looking down in shame for their earlier silence. Robert stood still through it all, saying nothing, letting the voices rise, not in outrage but in acknowledgement. Susan Bell, meanwhile, had stepped slightly backward, her posture wilting now under the weight of a truth that no longer belonged only to Robert and Angela, but to everyone aboard. Even Captain Reynolds finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, his authority tempered now by a dawning recognition. "Mr. Harris, I understand now that what we witnessed was not a policy issue, but a failure in perception." But Robert's gaze didn't soften, and he didn't rush to forgive or smooth over the moment. Instead, he nodded once, then spoke for all to hear. "Understanding is a beginning, Captain, but so is accountability." In that cabin, what had begun as one woman's quiet humiliation was transforming into something more powerful. A collective reckoning with the ease of assumption and the cost of silence. And as passengers straightened in their seats and voices rose, not in anger but in truth, a line was being drawn gently but firmly in the air itself. Fairness was not optional, respect was not conditional, and dignity, once denied, demanded restoration. Robert Harris stood motionless, his figure an anchor in the shifting atmosphere of the cabin. His eyes did not move from Captain Reynolds, whose composure was beginning to show the hairline cracks of a man forced to confront something far deeper than a seating dispute. The silence had become its own force, stretching taut between crew and passengers until Robert, in a voice as calm as it was resolute, broke it. "This flight will not depart with this crew responsible for what just occurred." His words were not a demand, they were a decision already made, offered not for negotiation but for acknowledgement. The air seemed to tighten as his gaze moved deliberately from the captain to Susan Bell and then to Mark Evans, the first officer who had quietly watched the earlier exchange, lending his silent endorsement with inaction. Susan Bell's face flushed, her mouth opening, then closing again, her practiced professionalism failing her now as the weight of consequence descended. Mark Evans shifted uncomfortably near the cockpit door, his arms crossed tightly, but the veneer of detachment had vanished from his posture. He looked suddenly smaller, diminished not by accusation but by the collective awareness filling the cabin. Robert spoke again, addressing Captain Reynolds directly. "Captain, I am formally requesting that Lead Attendant Susan Bell and First Officer Mark Evans be removed from this flight, effective immediately. Their conduct is incompatible with the dignity expected of anyone entrusted with passenger care." Captain Reynolds hesitated, A pause just long enough to reveal the calculation behind his measured facade. But then he inclined his head slowly, reluctantly, as the truth pressing against the windows and walls of the cabin became too large to ignore. "Understood, Mr. Harris," he replied, his voice quieter now. "I will make the call." Nina Thompson, who had remained near the galley, stepped forward at that moment, her presence a quiet reinforcement of what fairness required. Robert turned to her with a slight nod and said, "Nina, would you please escort my wife back to seat 1A? Angela, still seated with unwavering grace at row 28, rose without hesitation, gathering her bag with smooth precision. She walked the length of the cabin with her back straight, her gaze forward, passing Susan Bell without a glance, passing passengers who now looked at her not with curiosity or doubt, but with a kind of quiet respect, a respect born not from status, but from the dignity she had displayed when dignity had mattered most. She sat down again in seat 1A as if she had never left it, her presence reclaiming not just the physical space, but something far greater, the standard for how any passenger, any human being should be treated. A few passengers offered soft applause, not raucous, not performative, but enough to mark the moment as one that mattered. Susan Bell and Mark Evans began gathering their belongings, their movements stiff, mechanical, the eyes of the entire cabin upon them. No insults followed them, no jeering, no vindictive satisfaction, only silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than words. The kind that accompanies truth, landing fully, finally. Robert Harris did not watch them leave. His attention had already returned to Angela, whose calm was now matched by the stillness spreading throughout the plane. When Susan and Mark stepped off the aircraft, escorted by another uniformed supervisor who had arrived at the door, Robert turned back to Captain Reynolds and said evenly, "This isn't just about my wife. It's about every passenger you've ever misjudged and every passenger who deserves better from this airline moving forward." The captain gave a quiet nod, one of concession, not contrition, and began to call for standby crew to replace the two dismissed staff. The cabin door remained open, but something far more significant had already closed. The tolerance for assumption, the acceptance of silent prejudice. Angela sat once more in seat 1A, her expression serene but her presence unmissable, restored not by privilege, but by the principle that fairness once denied must be restored, publicly, fully, and without apology. The hum of quiet conversation resumed, but its texture had changed. No longer the idle murmurs of strangers preparing for takeoff. It now carried the weight of reflection. Soft-spoken admissions, thoughtful glances, a collective recognition that something real had just unfolded in this cabin. Angela Harris sat calmly in 1A, her posture unchanged, but now every glance that met hers carried a silent respect, not rooted in status, but in something deeper, dignity earned, dignity defended. Her hands folded lightly over her leather-bound journal, still unopened, as if this chapter of her journey had demanded its own story first. Robert remained standing near the forward galley a moment longer, his gaze moving deliberately over the cabin, not seeking acknowledgement, but ensuring presence. His presence, Angela's presence, and the presence of a standard newly restored. He turned toward Captain Reynolds and spoke one final time, not in anger but in clarity. "This flight isn't just carrying passengers today, Captain. It's carrying accountability. And that will travel farther than any destination." Then he leaned gently toward Angela, his voice low but steady. "Do you want me to stay on board?" She looked up at him, her eyes warm but resolute. "You've done what mattered. I'm fine now." He smiled, an expression of pride wrapped in quiet relief. then turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out to address the passengers, not with a speech, but with a single sentence. "We can't fly forward if we're still deciding who belongs." With that he exited, leaving the cabin filled not with noise, but with a profound stillness, the kind that lingers long after engines roar to life. Angela exhaled slowly, her gaze falling on Maria Rodriguez seated across the aisle in 2C. Maria leaned slightly toward her and said gently, "If I had your grace, my life would have been different." Angela smiled softly. "Grace isn't about letting things go," she replied. "It's about carrying them properly." Edward Clark, seated quietly in 1B, glanced over, offering her a nod, not the stiff politeness from earlier, but an acknowledgement both personal and sincere. Outside, a warm summer breeze moved gently across the tarmac, but inside the cabin something stronger had taken root, a promise, unspoken yet understood, that fairness must travel in every seat. And as Flight 472 finally pushed back from the gate, Angela closed her eyes, not in defeat, not in weariness, but in peace.